Hello there, and welcome to week one of your first module in the class. So you'll note on Blackboard that I have put all of the PowerPoint slides for module one. These are just to help you organize your thoughts around the readings and focus on specific concepts and terms and definitions. So I don't provide you with the definitions, but when you see words on the slide, just know that those are important terms that you really need to have a good understanding of. And of course, it's not enough just to pull those terms and define them like vocabulary words, but you really need to understand them in the context of the reading. So just think about that as you're going through the different PowerPoint slides. I want to just go through some of the basic information for week one, and then just give a little bit of a mini lecture regarding feminist theory and worldview and the feminist movement. I think it's important that you have an understanding of that really I spend a lot of time on that in a regular semester, and so I want to make sure that you receive some information about that directly from me. So at the beginning of module one, you are responsible for reading chapter one, which includes a lot of the basic concepts for the rest of the course. Some of those concepts are going to be found in the reading, and you'll notice on the first slide after the introductory slide, it says paradigms and worldviews, and you have three terms: essentialism, minimalism, and maximalism. Those are explained in chapter one, and those are just ways that we see the world. So as you're reading through chapter one, think about your own ways of viewing the world, your own ways of understanding and explaining human behavior. So for example, you might think about your own gender expression, okay? The way that you live your life, some of the characteristics that you have as a male, as a female, and think about, why do I have those characteristics? If I'm really assertive and strong and independent, how do I make sense of having those characteristics? Do I have those characteristics because they're biological, somehow related to my hormone levels in my body? Do I think I'm that way because my brain is structured differently? Do I think that that's just a difference that women and men have, and somehow we come by it naturally? Do I think I have those characteristics because I was taught those things in my childhood, or maybe the environment that I was in, I witnessed some of those behaviors that people of my same gender had? Did I go through something in my childhood that was particularly formative, or maybe even something traumatic that shaped those things? So be thinking about how you explain your own behavior and the behavior of other people. And then take a look at essentialism, minimalism, and maximalism. And then as you go through the slides and through your reading, you're going to see the branches of psychology. Your textbook talks about structuralism, functionalism, behavioralism, and then psychoanalysis. And it talks about just sort of the history of psychology, specifically as it addressed things like biological sex and gender. And align yourself, or see where you think you would align yourself in terms of your own belief. As we go through this semester, and as you pay attention to these readings and focus on your own experiences, you also need to be aware of different sociological perspectives that we use. There's the micro perspective, the meso perspective, and the macro perspective. You may have heard these, and probably have heard these in other classes, but just make sure you understand that if we're talking about societal movements, for example, or if we're talking about phenomenon that we see occurring within a society, that would be the macro level, right? We're kind of zooming out from our own experience, and we're thinking about what we see is true in a society. When we kind of zoom in just a little bit, we're talking about a meso level of perspective, and this level is more about group membership. So for example, as a white female, What are some of the specific things that I might experience or know about at that meso level, at that group level, as a white female, or even I could say as a faculty member? You see, it's a group identification. But then we zoom in really closely to a micro level perspective. And the micro level is at the individual level. So one of the conflicts that you may experience this semester is that you're reading about experiences that are really being reported on at the macro level. They're being studied a lot of times at the macro level or at the meso level. But you as an individual may say, well, gosh, I don't really experience that. I've never had that experience. As a female, you may say, I don't think I've ever been sexually harassed. Even though the data show this, that's not something I personally have experienced. That's okay. Just understand that what you are reporting on is your own micro level of experience. And a lot of what we're going to be reading about is the macro level or meso level of experience. And so just important when we're talking about sociological phenomena that we understand that there are different levels there that we have to consider when we're talking about data. And we'll talk a little bit more about that when we get to chapter 2. Then as you go through chapter 1, you're going to read about the history of the women's movement. You're going to learn a little bit about the men's movement that emerged out of the women's movement. And I would encourage you to just familiarize yourself with what that history looked like. You don't have to have a great deal of detail in your understanding of that, but just sort of understand how that transpired. And then you'll come to a slide that says common terms for this course. Now, these are terms that are not necessarily in the chapter, but they are terms that I always like to go over at the beginning of the semester because they matter from a feminist perspective. You'll see the term power, privilege, hegemony, dominance hierarchy. And with dominance hierarchy, I've given you a chart that is an example of what that means. Then you'll see invisible behavior, backlash, androcentric bias, and heteronormativity. Just make sure that you understand these terms. Let's talk about power. When we are learning about phenomena from a feminist perspective, that requires that we have an understanding of power differentials. And in order to understand power, we have to understand that it's something that occurs in a relationship. And I want to give you an example of that. So if I saw you out on the street, or I saw you at the grocery store, or I saw you at the sub, I, as an individual, I don't really have a great deal of power. And you, as an individual, probably don't have a great deal of power necessarily. Your power only comes when you think about particular relationships that you're in. So, for example, if I see you in the sub, we are two people that don't have a ton of power in the world. However, when I speak to you this way, and I'm on this end of Blackboard, I have a great deal of power. Why is that? Think about why I have so much power. Well, you've probably very quickly drawn the conclusion it's because I'm going to be grading your work. I'm going to be scoring your work. I'm going to be giving you a final grade in this course. I have the ability to affect your outcome. That gives me a great deal of power, but only in the relationship I have with you. When this semester is over, I'm not going to have a lot of power in your life, and you're not going to have a lot of power in mine. So do you see the power differentials that emerge in relationship? And then pay attention to the definition. It's a multiple definition. It's the capacity to affect the quality of another person's outcomes. It also includes control over resources. So think about in Western culture, for example, what resources are we talking about? Well, because we live in a capitalistic society, we can be talking about money first and foremost. And people that have a lot of money tend to have a lot of power that goes along with that. But you may think of some other resources that may exist within a relationship. maybe having a lot of friends or a lot of familial support. Maybe some people would consider that a resource that would give them some sort of power. Think about family relationships and who has more power in those relationships. And then again, the last part of the definition says that we have to remember that power only exists within the context of those relationships. So keep that in mind as we move forward. The next term that I really want to flesh out for you is privilege. And, in living in Texas or living in the South, a lot of times people will say, oh, I feel so privileged to be here. Or, I could say to you, I feel so privileged to be an instructor at this university and be able to teach a class like this. And I do feel like that. It's a privilege. But in the context of this class and in the context of feminism, when we use the word privilege, we're talking about an unearned benefit that is usually bestowed upon someone at birth. So, for example, in our society, if you are born into an English-speaking family, that is a privilege. You are born into privilege. Why? Well, because in the United States, the predominant language that we use is English. And so if you're born into a family that speaks English regularly, that's going to give you a little bit of a leg up. That's a privilege. It's not something you earned. It's not something that you had to struggle to figure out on your own. It's something you were born into. Likewise, if you're born into white skin, if you're born with white skin, that gives you a certain amount of privilege. It's not something you had to work for. It's not a degree you had to earn. It's something that really was given to you because you were born with white skin. Now, this is where some people can get really uncomfortable because it's as if we're saying, well, people with white skin have all this privilege and they're bad because they have that. That's not at all what we're saying. I'm going to talk a little bit more about that and farther along in this lecture about how we really need to be thinking about privilege. But just think about, there are some benefits that we have because of circumstances that we're born into. If I'm born into a fully functioning body and I have no difference in physical ability, that's a privilege. That's different from someone who may be born without a limb, for example. Maybe they were born without hands or arms, or maybe they were born hearing impaired or vision impaired. I think we can all see how having my vision and having my hearing, that's a privilege. It's not something I earned. It's just something I was born with, and my life's going to be a little bit easier because I have that privilege. So keep that in mind as you're thinking about privileges. Then let's move down to dominance hierarchy. This is a term that is again related to power and privilege. And it is very simply the way that human beings tend to categorize people or organize people into different categories based on their characteristics and at levels depending upon the amount of power and privilege they have. So if you look at the slide, it says dominance hierarchy examples in Western societies. You'll see the categories listed at the top and then the examples listed in the categories in their columns. And the categories at the top have the most power. And as you go down the category list, those are people that have the least amount of power. So for example, in our culture, if you are born male, you are born with more privilege than females. Now, this is certainly not, the early 1900s, okay? Women have achieved a great deal. Women have gained some power and some privilege in this world. But we still live in a patriarchal or male-dominant society. And so we can see that males are going to be up here and females are going to be a little bit below them just in terms of power and privilege. And then you can go across the list. Gender roles. Masculine gender roles tend to be favored over feminine gender roles. We'll go into more detail on that later. If you look at race or ethnicity, White people tend to have more power and privilege than Hispanic people or Black people. Again, we go down that list. You can see social class, sexual orientation, ability. You can even look at religion. So different categories that we would put ourselves in. We can create a column very much like this and kind of get a sense for where we fit in society in terms of our own power and privilege. Keep that in mind. We will refer back to that throughout the semester. Then you'll see invisible behaviors. These are things that we take for granted, that we don't ever really shine a spotlight on. We don't talk about it in depth. And because of that, they remain invisible for the most part. So I'll give you this example, and this example will come up again later. But if you see here on my left hand, forgive my bruise, I was in a car accident recently. If you see this ring on my finger, you know this is a wedding ring. And I wear this because I am married. But why am I wearing a ring? And why is it on the left hand? And why is it on the third finger? You ever thought about that? You ever questioned that? When I got married, I wore a white dress. And that's pretty typical. Have you ever asked yourself, why do we do that? When I got married, my father walked me down the aisle and he gave me away to my future husband. Again, nothing unusual about that, very status quo. But at the time I did it, I never questioned doing it. I never thought about why I was doing it. Those are examples of invisible behaviors. And when we talk about gendered behaviors and gender stereotypes, very oftentimes we're talking about invisible behaviors that never get examined. But in this course, we're going to examine a lot of them. And we're going to get down to the nitty-gritty of why and how these behaviors developed in the first place. So that's a lot of what we talk about in gender. Backlash. Okay, a backlash is something that occurs when people in power feel like their power is threatened by a group that has less power, and so they push back. I'll give you an example of this. If you think about the civil rights movement, as African Americans, as Black people began to gain more rights and privileges in this country, more rights and benefits, there was a backlash from what group? White people. Okay? Didn't happen all over the country, but if you think about the civil rights movement, specifically in the South, as white people began to see Black people gaining the right to vote, desegregation, all of these things that were happening during the civil rights movement, there was an increase or an uptick in things like lynchings and murders and protests. And that's because white people began to feel threatened that Black people were gaining in power. So they pushed back. We've also seen this throughout history. If you look at really any movement, and we'll focus specifically on our country and specifically in the last 100 years, if you look at any movement where people in power began to feel threatened, you are going to be able to find a backlash where they pushed back against it. We also saw this in the women's rights movement. As you learn in chapter 1, the women's rights movement really began to pick up speed in the late 60s and then through the 70s. And as a result of that, there was a lot of backlash by men and also by some women who did not believe in the women's movement. They pushed back against that because they felt like their way of life or their belief system or their power really was in question. So be thinking about that as you're reading in chapter 1 and as you're reading the articles on feminism. Androcentric bias, heteronormativity, those are things that are relatively self-explanatory by what you see here on the definitions. Then we move into some very important terms from chapter 1, sex and gender. You know, a lot of times when I tell people, they'll ask me, well, what do you teach at Texas Tech? And I say, I teach gender development. And they'll kind of look at me funny and say, I didn't know gender developed. I thought that's just what you were born with. What happens is that people tend to conflate the word sex and the word gender. So if you're talking about sex, it is assumed you're talking about gender and vice versa. What science understands is that sex and gender are actually two different concepts. We talk about sex, and what we're really talking about is a person's biological makeup. Okay, so we're talking about things like chromosomes and hormones and anatomy. But when we talk about gender, we're talking about psychological and sociological characteristics that also have been agreed upon in a society. But sex and gender do not necessarily have to be the same. This is where we get the idea of a cisgender person and a transgender person. I identify as cisgender. What that means is that my biology is female and my gender is female or feminine. And so I am cisgender. There's a correlation or a sameness to my sex and my gender. For someone who identifies as transgender, there's a difference. So their biological sex does not match up with their psychological and sociological gender. That's transgender. And then we have the term queer. And I remember studying queer theory back in the late 90s and early 2000s. And it has emerged now to be this very commonly used term that people use sort of as an umbrella identification. So if someone identifies as queer, they may be lesbian, they may be gay, they may be transgender, they may be non-binary, they may be asexual, they may be pansexual. There are many different terms that fall under that heading of queer. So just understand that as an umbrella term that identifies someone that falls out of the sexual binary that our culture has prescribed. Which takes us to the next term, which is a binary or dichotomous system. This is the system that most of the world operates under. And it is a system in which there are only two sexes, male and female, and they are distinct, they are very different, even opposite. So you might even think about if you have a spectrum, you may have males on one end and females on the other, so that as you become more female, you necessarily are less male, and vice versa. So that binary system, it's either or, okay? That's how the world operates. And it often leads to a lot of assumptions about people's behavior. So for example, if I used to wait tables in college. And if I'm walking up to wait on a table and I see a person sitting at the table and I realize, oh, I'm not sure if that person is a male or a female. In my head, there are only two options. They've either got to be male or they've got to be female. But based on what I'm seeing and based on how this person is presenting themselves, I've got some assumptions. Well, this person has long hair, so they should be female because that goes with, long hair goes with being female. But wait, I've seen some men with long hair. Well, they're not wearing makeup, so that means they've got to be male. Wait a minute, that's an assumption I'm making about females, that they all wear makeup or should wear makeup. Well, they're sitting with their legs crossed. Okay, that's an assumption I'm going to associate with being female. Males don't do that, but wait a minute. Some males do that. So in a moment like that, and maybe you've had a moment like that too, often what happens is we feel very uncomfortable inside all of a sudden. And we're not sure how to interact with this person or how to communicate with this person. That's not because we are inherently sexist or homophobic or any of those things. It's that our society is built on a binary system with certain assumptions and rules. And when we look at a person that doesn't seem to fit in that binary system because they don't follow those assumptions or rules, we don't know how to interact with them because our language, our relationships are built on this idea of a binary. Now, we're living in a time now where that's changing. The world is opening up more and becoming more open and accepting for people to be who they really are, for them to be who they feel they are. And so this has really thrown our binary system out the window, and it's really caused us to rethink some of the assumptions and gender roles that we've had in place for a very long time in our Western civilization. So be thinking about that. Think about everything in our culture that is based around a binary. Okay, think about that. Then we have gender identity, gender role, gender stereotype. You can read more about those in the text. And then we have this 4-factor model. The slide right after the visual explains what this is, but this is not in your textbook. The 4-factor model is the way our society assumes that if I know one of these 4 factors, then I can assume the rest. For example, if you find out I am female, you look at me and you go, oh yeah, she's a female. You know my biological sex, or you think you do. And then you assume that I am female, I identify as female, I have a female or feminine gender role, and I'm heterosexual. Just based off looking at me and listening to me talk, before I've said anything about who I'm married to or how I exist in the world. And we do this for other people. This is where those categories come into play. I look at someone and I think, okay, I know their biological sex, so I'm assuming these other things about them. Or maybe you're not looking at someone, maybe you're listening to someone, you're having a phone conversation maybe, and you hear their voice, and because their voice sounds masculine, you assume those other characteristics about them. And then you see them in person and realize, oh wow, not what I was expecting. That's the 4-factor model. And it works most of the time. If you think about people in your life or people that you interact with, these are some of the assumptions that we make. Then the last slide for chapter 1 just has different sexual orientations. This is not human sexuality, so we're not going to be talking about a lot of these. I really include this information just to make some distinctions and help you differentiate between gender and sex and sexual orientation. So for example, sometimes when students are talking about an individual who is cisgender, they will talk about them being straight or heterosexual just because they are cisgender. Or a lot of times people will talk about a transgender individual and they'll make assumptions that they are gay or lesbian. Remember, we cannot make those assumptions. And sexual orientation is varied, just like we understand gender now is varied. It's a spectrum. And so please keep that in mind, especially in your writings. Make sure that when you're writing about gender, you're writing about gender and not sexual orientation. Hope that makes sense to you. So that's chapter 1. I was much more long-winded than I wanted to be. I will try to do better on this next lecture, which is about feminism, and we'll go much more in depth. So I hope that clarified some things for you. If you're confused about anything, make sure that you reach out to me and I'll be happy to clarify.